By the mid-1960s, 5 countries have nuclear weapons. Then, in South Asia, 2 rival neighbors, India and Pakistan, each decide they cannot let the other have a nuclear advantage, turning a decades-old territorial dispute into one of the most dangerous nuclear standoffs on Earth. This episode is the story of how India tested its first nuclear device in 1974 under a program it called Peaceful, how Pakistan raced to catch up out of fear and humiliation, and how both countries eventually declared themselves openly nuclear within weeks of each other in 1998. We'll see how the wars of 1947, 1965, and 1971 shaped both nations' fears, how India's peaceful 1974 test changed everything, how Pakistan's scientist Abdul Qadeer Khan built a secret enrichment program, and how both countries finally went fully public with tests in May 1998. By the end, you'll understand why 2 neighbors sharing a border and a violent history both concluded that only nuclear weapons could guarantee their survival, and why that decision still shapes one of the world's most watched nuclear flashpoints today. To understand this story, you have to go back to 1947, when British India is partitioned into 2 independent countries, India and Pakistan. The partition is chaotic and violent, triggering mass migration, communal violence, and deep, lasting mistrust between the 2 new nations. Almost immediately, India and Pakistan go to war over the disputed region of Kashmir. This first war in 1947 and 1948 sets a pattern that will repeat for decades. Both countries claim Kashmir, and both are willing to fight over it. A second war erupts in 1965, again centered on Kashmir, ending in a stalemate that satisfies neither side. Both nations emerge from these conflicts convinced that the other represents a permanent existential threat. The most devastating conflict comes in 1971, when India intervenes in a brutal civil war in East Pakistan, helping create the independent nation of Bangladesh. Pakistan suffers a humiliating military defeat and loses roughly half of its population and territory in a matter of weeks. This defeat is catastrophic for Pakistan's sense of security. Pakistani leaders conclude that conventional military strength alone cannot guarantee the country's survival against a larger, more powerful India. The search for a more permanent deterrent begins almost immediately. Meanwhile, India has been developing nuclear technology since the 1950s under its Atomic Energy Commission, initially framed entirely around civilian energy and scientific research, led by physicist Homi Bhabha, who becomes a central figure in India's early nuclear ambitions. India's nuclear program grows with international assistance in its early years, including a research reactor supplied partly through Canadian and American cooperation, intended for peaceful scientific purposes under international safeguards. Everything changes in 1962, when China defeats India in a brief but humiliating border war. 2 years later, China successfully tests its own nuclear weapon. For Indian leaders, this combination of military defeat and a nuclear-armed neighbor becomes deeply alarming. Indian leaders begin to seriously debate whether the country needs its own nuclear deterrent, not necessarily against Pakistan, but against a much larger and now nuclear-armed China. This strategic calculation becomes a major driver behind India's eventual weapons program. Through the late 1960s and early 1970s, Indian scientists and engineers, working under the framework of peaceful nuclear research, quietly developed the technical capability to produce plutonium and design a working nuclear device, even as the government publicly denies any weapons intentions. On May 18, 1974, India detonates its first nuclear device at the Pokhran test range in the Rajasthan desert. The government calls the test Smiling Buddha and insists it is a peaceful nuclear explosion intended for research rather than weapons purposes. Despite the peaceful label, the international community understands exactly what has happened. India has demonstrated a functional nuclear weapons capability. The test sends shockwaves through the region, especially in neighboring Pakistan. Pakistani Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto reacts with a now famous declaration, vowing that Pakistan will match India's capability no matter the cost, even if the country's people have to eat grass to achieve it. Bhutto turns to a Pakistani metallurgist living in Europe named Abdul Qadeer Khan, who has gained access to sensitive uranium enrichment technology while working at a European nuclear engineering consortium. Khan returns to Pakistan in 1976, bringing critical technical knowledge with him. Khan establishes and leads Pakistan's uranium enrichment program, using centrifuge designs and technical knowledge acquired during his time in Europe. His work becomes the backbone of Pakistan's path to nuclear weapons, distinct from the plutonium route India had pursued. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, Pakistan's program advances steadily, often through a global network of suppliers and intermediaries that Khan helps establish, procuring components and materials from multiple countries despite international non-proliferation efforts. By the mid-1980s, most intelligence agencies believe Pakistan has developed a functional nuclear weapons capability, even though the country, like India in its early years, refrains from openly declaring or testing a device. Both countries now exist in an unusual standoff. Each strongly suspects the other has nuclear weapons, but neither has publicly tested or declared them. This uneasy, undeclared balance continues for roughly 2 more decades. Tensions periodically flare, including during a serious military crisis in 1990 and a more prolonged confrontation in the Kargil region in 1999, each time raising international concern about the possibility of a conflict between 2 undeclared nuclear powers escalating out of control. In May 1998, India decides to end decades of ambiguity. On May 11th and 13th, it conducts a series of 5 nuclear tests at Pokhran, this time openly declaring itself a nuclear weapons state rather than hiding behind the language of peaceful research. Just 17 days later, on May 28, 1998, Pakistan responds with its own series of nuclear tests at the Chagai Hills in Baluchistan, ending its own ambiguity and formally announcing that Pakistan, too, is now a declared nuclear weapons state. With these 2 rounds of tests, both India and Pakistan officially and publicly join the nuclear club, becoming the 6th and 7th countries in the world to openly declare nuclear weapons capability, all within a span of just 17 days. International reaction is swift and critical. Both countries face economic sanctions from the United States and other nations, though these sanctions are relatively short-lived, as strategic considerations eventually outweigh punitive measures on both sides. Strategically, the openly declared arsenals of India and Pakistan introduce a new and dangerous dynamic in South Asia. 2 nuclear-armed neighbors with a long history of conflict, a disputed border in Kashmir, and no fully agreed-upon crisis communication mechanisms. Since 1998, both countries have developed increasingly sophisticated delivery systems, including a range of ballistic missiles capable of reaching deep into each other's territory, further complicating the security calculations in the region. Both nations maintain their nuclear programs are purely defensive, intended to deter aggression rather than to strike first. But the close geographic proximity between India and Pakistan means that any nuclear exchange would happen with almost no warning time. Unlike the longer-range standoffs of the Cold War, this proximity has led to the development of specific crisis management protocols between the 2 countries, including agreements not to attack each other's nuclear facilities and periodic exchanges of information about missile tests, though tensions still flare regularly. So how did India and Pakistan both get the bomb? Decades of war and partition created deep mutual mistrust. India's 1974 peaceful test triggered Pakistan's urgent response under A.Q. Khan, and both nations finally abandoned ambiguity with dueling tests in May 1998. The result is a nuclear standoff unlike any other. Two hostile neighbors sharing a long border and an unresolved territorial dispute, each holding weapons capable of devastating the other within minutes, making South Asia one of the most closely watched nuclear flashpoints in the world today. In our next episode, we turn to a country that took the exact opposite path from Israel's silence: North Korea. A nation that has used loud, public nuclear tests and open threats as its primary tool of survival and leverage on the world stage.